This blended Scotch whisky is apparently unfairly overlooked. This week, let's see if the Teacher's Highland Cream is worth checking out. Welcome back to the channel. I'm Matt, I'm the Whiskey Nerd, and like I said, this week I'm looking at the Teacher's Highland Cream. So let's get it into the glass and I'll tell you a little bit more about it. Now, first off, I am a little bit exploring Scotch whisky lately. Now, I have unfairly, I think, overlooked a lot of Scotch whiskies because my focus has been on Irish whiskey because there's a lot of really great Irish whiskies on the market today. But a friend of mine bought me a bunch of small bottles of different kind of Scotch whiskies to kind of give me a rounded out kind of idea and picture of what Scotch whisky is all about, and he chose this one as the blended Scotch whisky because apparently a lot of Scotch whiskies, the majority of them are not actually single malts. Most Scotch whiskies are going to be blended whiskies, whether that's a blend of malt and grain or a blend of different kind of malts, but blending is one of the main things about Scotch whisky. Before I get into the main details of this whisky, if you've got any recommendations for me for Scotch whiskies to try out, let me know down below because I'd love to hear from you. I got some great recommendations of the Glenallachie whiskies, and I've got the 10-year-old cask strength, the 12-year-old and the 15-year-old, all of which I really enjoyed, and I will be making reviews of those in the coming months. But if you've got any ideas for different blended scotches, let me know down below. But let's focus today on this one right here, the Teacher's blended Scotch. There isn't a huge amount of information available on the Teacher's blended Highland Cream Scotch whisky. Apparently it's been around for a long time and it is kind of one of those blends I think has been overlooked. It's owned by the Beam Suntory company, like they bought it a while back, so it's kind of become part of their portfolio and maybe it's just kind of fallen by the wayside. Apparently they use a lot of peated malt in the blend, so it's a blend of malt and grain whiskey, and apparently they use a lot of peated malt. Now, they don't define what a lot is, like it could be 5%, it could be 10%, it could be 25%. What is a lot could vary depending on the distillery, but they say they use a lot of that peated malt in here. It does come in at 40%. It is a non-age statement whiskey and it does have caramel colouring, so I'm guessing it's going to be on the cheaper side. It's going to be on the lower side of that peated malt, but because peated malt brings with a lot of flavour, you can use a smaller amount, and because it has that caramel colouring, because it doesn't have an age statement, I'm guessing it is going to be on the younger side and maybe not in the most exciting types of barrels. There is a bit of speculation that the peated malt that goes into this whiskey did come from the Ardmore distillery because that distillery is also part of the Beam Suntory family, so that might be where they got the peated malt from, but there's no real information about where they got the grain from or if they indeed did get the peated malt from the Ardmore distillery. So that's pretty much all I was able to find out about this. If you know more, let me know down below, but right now I'm just going to go in for the nose. Okay, so one thing I did note about this with the first time I kind of tasted it, as you can see I've tasted it a few times now, the name Highland Cream, it actually does come through with a fair bit of creaminess. Like there's a fair amount of like strong vanilla sweet cream up front with like a backbone of that peated malt. Like the peated malt, it's not like really smoky, it's not really dense, it's more like an earthy malt where you get like a little bit of almost floral kind of peat flavor to it as opposed to like the peat smoke. Like there is still a bit of peat smoke in there, but it's definitely more, I'd say, on the floral side than a heavy duty hit of smoke. There's also like some of those kind of like cooked grain notes, like, you know, it's not quite like a biscuit. It's kind of like almost like a shortbread biscuit, you know, where it's not like been really heavily like crunchy baked, but it's that little bit of like buttery creaminess, the little bit of that creamy grains and some sweetness coming through. There's some kind of caramel notes, kind of like almost like a caramel apple on it. You know, when you have that caramel dipped, you know, the apple dipped in caramel, kind of like that. But I will note that there's a certain component, a certain flavor you get with like kind of mass-produced, kind of cheap grain whiskey, and there is that here. Like it's a little bit of like shiny, metallic, that kind of like not quite nail polish remover, but in that direction where you get that shiny, kind of glassy, you get that idea of a smell, and that's coming through here. Like I'm on the record, I do quite like grain whiskey when it's done well, but when you kind of mass produce it, there is a chance that grain whiskey can kind of get this kind of almost cheap feeling, and that's kind of what is coming through here on the nose. Like there is some nice notes there, but then you got this kind of core of that kind of sharp, kind of metallic, kind of shiny grain whiskey coming through, and it does take away from the nose a little bit, but by and large the nose is broadly quite nice, especially since this is a pretty cheap whiskey. So that's all there is really on the nose, so I'm going to go in now for the palate on the Teacher's Highland Cream. Cheers. It is light, it is still kind of creamy, still kind of sweet with those cooked grains coming through. The peat appears as soon as you swallow it, like that peat smoke. It's not really apparent immediately up front on the palate, but it does come through as you swallow it. But that shiny, metallic kind of grain whiskey note that was there in the nose, much more present here in the palate, much more developed and like almost overshadowing the other notes. Like still getting those kind of appley notes, maybe more like an apple juice rather than that caramel apple. Still sweet, but in a different direction. Still got those cooked grains. Still got that light kind of vanilla note. Still kind of creamy, but yeah, that grain note is there. So I'm gonna go in again, but I'm gonna try and get past that grain note and see if we can find any of the other flavors. Cheers. I don't want to call this whiskey like one note, because obviously there's more than one note to it, but the flavors I was getting on the nose, they're pretty much replicated on the palate. Slightly different, but you know, it's the same flavors. It's not like I'm suddenly getting a bit of sherry influence, or I'm suddenly getting a bit of extra oak spiciness to it. Like there's not really a huge hit of oak spice to it at all. Like I said, this might be quite young, like the colour from it is probably that caramel colouring, so it might be quite young. It might be in second or third fill oak casks, so it might not be getting a huge amount of that oak flavour coming through. But it's just, yeah, it's like that same kind of notes in the nose. It's creamy, it's kind of sweet, it's quite light. It is only at 40% ABV. It's got a bit of that peat smoke, again kind of leaning more towards floral than like really heavily duty smokiness. There's not really a huge amount of like that brininess that you might associate with like an Islay Scotch, where you get that almost salt air note like you might get like in a Bowmore or one of those kind of heavy duty Scotches. It's just kind of light, sweet, appley. Again, that grain note is taking it down for me. Like there are some good notes in here, but they are getting overshadowed by that grain, kind of that cheaper grain, shiny metallic note. So I'm going to go in again, but I'm going to focus on the finish and see what I can find and see if there's anything new there. Cheers. Okay, so on the finish, like as soon as you swallow it, you get that kind of the peat smoke comes up to the fore. The fruitiness, like that kind of apple juice kind of note, that fades off. The peat smoke, it lasts for like a breath or two, then that fades off, and then you're just kind of left with like that kind of cooked grains of kind of like almost shortbready biscuit, a little bit of creaminess there, and that like ever-present kind of cheaper grain whiskey, that metallic, shiny, glassy, whatever word you have for it, you kind of probably know that style of flavor. That's there, and that's kind of cutting across the whole. That's probably the most kind of constant note across the whole of the whiskey, is that like that grain whiskey note that's coming through and kind of spoiling it a little bit. Before I give my final thoughts on this whiskey, if you're new here, scroll down, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button. I put out whiskey reviews like this every Wednesday, and I put out cocktail recipes featuring whiskey every Friday, and I will have a cocktail recipe featuring this whiskey right here this Friday. So if you want to see that, make sure you're subscribed. But now to the kind of final thoughts on this whiskey. Overall, I'm not super impressed by it. Like it's grand, it's cheap, it's low priced. I can understand it's coming in at a lower price, so it's not going to be super expensive, super great. Like my friend, when he bought me this, he said it was kind of a good example of an overlooked blended whiskey, and I can kind of see why it's overlooked, because it's not the best thing in the world. I wouldn't even put this in like in the same realm as like a Jameson, like Irish whiskey, those kind of bottom shelf, where Jameson is still a nice enough whiskey and it has a bit of sherry aging, it has a bit of bourbon aging, so it has, you know, multiple cask types going on. This is just pretty simple, straight down the middle, one note. Like there's nothing awful about it. Like I'm not tasting it and going, I gotta spit this out, I gotta pour it away. Like, I find uses for this in cocktails, but I'm not really impressed by it. I probably wouldn't buy this again. If you have any ideas for a good grain whiskey I could try out that would be better than this and be worth my time, let me know down below, because I would like to learn more about Scotch whiskies. But overall, I think I'm gonna find a use for this in a cocktail recipe. Like I said, if you want to see that recipe, come back on Friday. But right now, I am gonna drink this and I will make that video, and I will see you next time. Sláinte.